Psychology from the University of North Texas and is the author of the novel Midnight on Chapel Hill and the nonfiction book Sharpen Your Brain, Basic Logic in 39 Definitions. Jeff plans to return to UT Tyler in the fall for the Graduate Art History program. Please welcome Jeff Goodman.
The Barbaric, painted by Frank Frazetta in 1966, is the iconic image of a character, an archetype, and the distinctive style that defines the artist's work. A man stands atop a stark hill littered with symbols of death. A woman lies next to him, her figure adding an erotic tension to the painting, as well as a feminine polarity, further accentuating the masculine in the central figure by contrast. In spite of his companion, the man stands alone. His feet are set wide, his shoulders relaxed, yet the sheer mass of his muscles communicates an overwhelming vitality as well as an inestimable strength. His long hair and primitive necklace signify an animalistic ferocity, while the set of his head and steady, deep-set eyes hint at a keen, if brooding, intelligence. Frazetta was not the first to illustrate this character, created more than 30 years earlier by the pulp fiction author Robert E. Howard, but it was Frazetta's interpretation that became the standard. Admiring his own work decades later, Frazetta referred to the Barbarian as Conan the way he is. In other words, through his distinctive rendering, Frazetta captured and translated into visual form the essential distinctive qualities of Howard's literary creation. In this piece and in others, all of which served as cover art for reprints of Howard's stories, Frazetta employed his art to precisely reflect what Howard had done through the art of language in a way that no other artist could. Frank Frazetta lived from 1928 to 2010. He was born in Brooklyn and from a young age displayed an amazing artistic ability. For most of his life, Frazetta made his living producing art for comic books, and then for a short time Hollywood movie posters, before launching into the illustrated paintings he would become most famous for. Frazetta did receive several years of classical artistic training as a young person, while, as we will see, discovering the influence of canonical art on Frazetta's Conan illustrations is largely a process of inference. Those influences are clearly married with techniques derived from his work as a commercial artist and the demands of the marketplace for which the illustrations were intended. Frazetta began working professionally on comic books at the age of 16. Betty Valentine, in her introduction to the fantastic art of Frank Frazetta, gives a short but very convincing enumeration of how working in comics can shape both the ability and style of an artist. Drawing for such a restrictive medium is a demanding discipline. The space in which the artist must work is clearly defined and very limited. The inescapable box must accommodate not only a storyline, but an incredible amount of active, lively, appealing, striking action, which itself tells a story. The profusion of work required demands ingenuity to avoid repetitive imagery. Meanwhile, any talented artist must be concerned with the stamp of his own individuality in a medium where most often he is called upon to imitate an already established style. Looking at two examples of Frazetta's early 1950s comic book covers, his ability to draw in a viewer's eye while depicting a high-action story in a single frame is undeniably apparent. This ability was just as crucial in the Conan paintings that would serve as book covers years later. Another of those paintings, Man 8, done in 1967, is an illustration taken directly from the story Rogues in the House, and features Conan locked in one-on-one combat with a half-human, half-simian creature. The earthly monotone and blurred areas of the background serve to focus the viewer's eye on the central figures who are rendered with sharp detail by contrast. At the same time, the great red swath of the antagonist's cloak acts as an additional element to draw in the viewer's attention, both by virtue of its color and in shape, as it forms an X along with the other diagonal of the combined figures. The results of Frazetta's stylistic development through his work in comic books reveal themselves explicitly in his depiction of the human body as well. Thunda, in 1952, Frazetta undertook his first complete solo comic book entitled Thunda. Already here, the unique nuance with which Frazetta renders the male physique, as we see it later in his Conan paintings, is apparent in the detailed musculature of the hero and the athletic poses he strikes while engaged in action. Frazetta gives inspirational credit for Thunder to Hal Foster, the artist whose comic book adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan was featured in the Sunday newspapers of the 1930s. Viewing example images in sequence, a clear progression of stylistic development can be seen from Hal Foster's Tarzan through Thunder through to Frazetta's fully realized works. The Destroyer, 1971, is perhaps the most naturalistic example of the Conan illustrations of Frazetta's treatment of figure as well as of Conan's prowess in battle. Conan stands here atop a heap of his enemies. His bloodied axe is reared back right at the apex of a swing as he smashes the man in front of him in the face with the edge of his shield. In each figure, we see the extreme muscularity that is Frazetta's hallmark. In the figures of Conan's foes, however, there is a distinct difference. Compared to our hero, their bodies are all distorted in some way, to an extent beyond what posture and positioning can account for. The figure in the foreground is too hunched over. Surely we can take his stance as a sign of trepidation as he approaches to join battle. But even so, the forward curve of his back and shoulders seems unnatural. The back of the fallen man on the bottom right appears emaciated. The bulbous figure on the left, with the crown of his head toward us, seems too rounded and lumpy, suggesting he would not make an attractive figure were we to see him in full. The contrast of Conan's more idealized form with the distorted qualities of his enemies is a common theme in Frazetta's illustrations. Whether Conan is fighting giants, ape men, giant snakes, or other men-at-arms, what this quality depicts is a conflict between the human versus the inhuman. George Slusser, in his introduction to the book of essays, Unearthly Visions, Approaches to Science Fiction and Fantasy Art, proposes that the distinctive quality of science fiction and fantasy art is that it seeks to relocate the human being at the center of the visions it depicts. This is directly opposed to the canonical tradition of Western art that since the mid-19th century had challenged the classic iconic system centered on the human form. In the work of modern artists like Monet, Renoir, and Picasso, the human form was displaced from its previous place as central icon and often discarded altogether. It was in the realm of mostly illustrative science fiction and fantasy art that the human figure reemerged. Slusser defines science fiction art as a form of painting that represents the impact of scientific and technological advancement on human beings. He attaches fantasy art to that definition by a number of justifications, but either way, Frazetta's illustrations of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories fit the bill. In Howard's synoptic description of his fictional setting, he relies heavily on historical geology as well as Darwinian evolutionary theory to construct the lands and peoples of what he calls the Hyborian Age. Howard, in fact, highlighted racial distinctions among his characters to an extent that can be uncomfortable for contemporary readers. In doing this, he designates Conan's adversaries as being distinctly biologically other, even when they are in all respects just as human as he. Frazetta accomplishes the same effect in his paintings, not by highlighting differences his 1960s viewers would interpret as racial, but rather through variations in color and form, or by drawing from the more fantastical elements of the stories he is illustrating. The tension between the human and the inhuman in both Frazetta's and Howard's work is one that takes on multiple dimensions. David Hinckley, in his essay Conan the Oxymoron, a civilized savage, in Robert E. Howard and Frank Frazetta, focuses on the interplay of civilization and barbarity in the central character, as interpreted by both writer and artist. As one line of evidence, Hinckley points to the way Conan is clothed. His body is with almost mathematical precision is 50% naked and 50% armored. Referencing Snow Giants, 1967, Frazetta's illustration of the scene from The Frost Giant's Daughter, Hinckley points out that this pattern holds true even when the hero is fighting in what are presumably sub-zero temperatures. Conan's attire, which typically includes a horned helmet, wide girdle, and boots, is another seminal Frazetta innovation. As art book editor Ernie Fenner remarked in the biographical documentary Painting with Fire, up until that time, everything had to be so thoroughly enmeshed in Roman and Greek culture and Frank did something completely different. As evidenced by the Norman Sanders and Ed Esquiller book covers from the 1950s, Conan at that time was depicted in the armor and various other attire, including a cape in one instance and a plumed helmet in the other, viewers could readily associate with a Roman soldier. The 1960s was an era in which American culture underwent a number of social shifts, which placed higher value on feeling and imagination over the more regimented thinking of preceding generations. It was evidently a time when the American public was ready for a less rigidly defined male hero as well. Though Howard's stories had been reprinted in various editions over the course of the 30 years to that point, the paperbacks featuring Frazetta's cover art were an unprecedented success. As we have already seen, it would be reductionistic to interpret Frazetta's works merely as simple good versus evil allegories. The literature they correspond to portrays a greater level of complexity as well. In his classic introduction to the character in the story, The Phoenix on the Sword, Howard wrote, "Hither came Conan, the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to dread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet." This is not the introduction of a Lone Ranger, an altruistic 50s-era Superman, or even a King Arthur. Conan is an ethical character, but his ethics are closer to those of a Nietzschean individualist than any defender of traditional social norms. Howard sums up his hero's attitude towards civilized values toward the end of a story entitled The Black Stranger. After nonchalantly giving the treasure he has acquired through much bloodletting and strategy to someone he decides is in greater need, Conan says, "In civilized countries, I've seen people sick of gluttony while others were starving. I've seen men fall and die of hunger against the walls and shops of storehouses crammed with food. Sometimes I was hungry too, but then I took what I wanted at sword's point." A look to the world of cinema provides a hard confirmation the 1960s public was amenable to heroes who deviated from the simple good guy stereotype. Dr. No, the first James Bond film starring Sean Connery, premiered in 1962. 5 sequels followed from 1963 to 69. Though the lines between good and evil in the Bond films do tend to be fairly clear in the end, it is the hero's smooth, roguish, not to mention overtly virile nature that lends him his particular appeal. Another iconic movie hero made his debut at the same time as Conan's popular surge, Clint Eastwood's spaghetti western gunslinger, The Man with No Name. In the 1964 film, A Fistful of Dollars, Eastwood's character plays 2 feuding frontier families against each other, ostensibly at least for his own profit. The 2 sequels in 1965 and 67 follow the character through his adventures in bounty hunting and tracking down buried gold. Though Eastwood's gunslinger is closer to an anti-hero than the rugged yet noble John Wayne cowboy, he, like James Bond, became an archetype of masculine heroism, despite his antisocial qualities, or perhaps because of them. Another pop culture association highlights the defiant nature of Frazetta's art. The popularity of Mr. Frazetta's work coincided with the rise of heavy metal rock music in the early 1970s, and his otherworldly imagery showed up on a number of album covers, including Molly Hatchet's Flirting with Disaster and Nazareth's Expect No Mercy. Frazetta once said of himself, "I consider myself to be a creative artist, not just a fantasy illustrator. I stress good composition that borders on the abstract in spite of the subject matter." When looking at the muscularity of figures in Frazetta's work, an art historian is tempted to make direct comparisons to well-known canonical art such as that of Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci's anatomy drawings. While such comparisons can be quite striking, they open up a particular problem when discussing Frank Frazetta. As yet, there is very little information from which to determine what traditional art Frazetta was consciously inspired by. Between the ages of 8 and 16, Frazetta studied under Michael Falanga at the Brooklyn Academy of Fine Arts, what by all indications appears to have been a single professor institution. In his Painting with Fire interview, Frazetta speaks of that time fondly, but does not go into detail about the curriculum. No matter what he might have been learning in school, Frazetta's primary interests as a young person seem to have been comics and athletics. During his high school years, his talent as an athlete was such that the then New York Giants spent 2 years trying to sign him as a pitcher, but ultimately Frazetta refused, deciding instead to pursue his art. Frazetta's physical prowess was legendary among those who knew him. In just one of many stories, Frank Frazetta Jr. tells of his father knocking a 75-pound punching bag off its iron hook on the front porch of their house and 10 feet out into the lawn with one solid punch. It is a virtual certainty that Frazetta studied the depiction of anatomy during his years as an art student and was exposed to the work of Renaissance masters. Physicality, however, was something that he understood as well or better through direct experience as he did through study. Berserker, painted in 1967, is one painting in which we can find strong evidence that Frazetta was influenced by an entirely different art movement, symbolism. Other researchers have pointed out the unmistakable influence of symbolist works on some of Frazetta's paintings unrelated to the Conan stories. In some cases, this can shed light on imagery that might otherwise simply be read as bizarre. In discussing the symbolist influence on Berserker, we can see a strong counterpoint in War by Arnold Bachman. Bachman's depiction of the four horsemen of the apocalypse displays an almost identical color palette. There is fire and smoke in the background of both pieces. The respective protagonists fly through the air on their respective horses. But in Frazetta's painting, a kind of reversal has taken place. Rather than death, war, pestilence, and famine flying above, raining their evils down upon mankind, it is the superhuman hero who is about to rain down upon them. One further detail concerning Conan's figure in Berserker both ties the piece together thematically and alludes to an appreciation of the high art tradition on Frazetta's part. Conan has his arms flung wide, a gesture of reckless abandon in the face of his enemies. All manner of savagery is arrayed against him, and among them on the right is included a clear symbol of death itself. His pose, however, and perhaps even the look on his face, is also what it would be were he hanging on a cross. While interpreting a reference to the crucifixion from the illustration of a fantasy story might at first seem like an overstatement, it does resonate powerfully with the overall theme of the painting. This is, after all, the depiction of a man who has abandoned all concern for death and is totally resigned to his fate. It would also be a sly homage to Howard's stories as well. Like Christ, Conan, in the story A Witch Shall Be Born, was crucified on a cross. Unlike Christ, Conan did not give up the ghost, but rather survived to take bloody revenge upon those who put him there. From the detailed portrait of the barbarian to the various pieces that capture Conan at the height of action, Frank Frazetta's unique treatment of this character made his paintings both perfect illustrations and true works of art in their own right. Much has been said about Frazetta's interpretation of Robert E. Howard's barbaric hero by fans of both the art and the literature. For art historians, Frank Frazetta, the paintings discussed here and the total body of his work represent a gold mine or a Pandora's box for those brave and reckless enough to give them the serious treatment they deserve. Thank you. Yes.
Brother, I'm not trying to be a Philistine about this whole thing. I think people love this. It's cool. Right on. You talk about the advancement of technology and a little bit about that there's some kind of level of complexity and it establishes a certain kind of civilized values. But the gorilla in the room, of course, is the overt objectification of women and
yes.
misogyny and the being okay with violence.
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing up the issues that I prepared most to address from the question and answer. Quite obviously. I think there's a couple of things, especially when it comes to the treatment of female figures in Frazetta's work. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. Well, three things. First, I'm not going to try to defend this work against any kind of current sensibility or feminist assertion. That would be simply foolish on my part. However, when it comes to female figures in Frazetta's work, number one, what you've seen in this presentation does not come close to scratching the surface. That is actually a much bigger, much broader issue with many, many more examples of many and more various kinds than I could have put into this presentation. The female figures can be doing, as you see, in the one that is included in the Conan illustrations, they are often the warrior figure themselves. A good deal of what Frazetta does with female figures is mythologizing. He often uses them, employs them as a kind of a stand-in for natural forces. At times there will be a small female figure at the head of huge waves or, like a hurricane or something of that nature. So again, there's a lot more to talk about than what you see here. Also, it's important to remember too that Frazetta comes from kind of the late, either the early baby boomer or late so-called greatest generation. He comes from a time before our current sensibilities about these issues were really on people's minds to the extent that they are for us today. And that's not a defense of what he does, but that's to point out that Frazetta just isn't thinking about all that. He is neither coming from a feminist or a pro-violence or an anti-feminist or an anti-violence point of view. That kind of dichotomy is just not included in his thinking. So I hope that addresses some of that issue, at least. Are there other questions?
Do you think that maybe his audience has something to do with that? Because I think, those books are,
Oh, yeah.
they appeal, or the people that read them were like adolescent or pre-adolescent boys.
They're pretty much it's guy stuff.
Yeah.
That has a lot to do with it.
They're not going to worry about misogyny, or anything. They want that.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's also interesting, whenever this is one of the first things I thought about when doing my research. And so when I went to try to take a look at thinking maybe this is a reaction to feminism, or maybe that this is, there's something I could talk about with regards to that in the historical context. If you go and you look at a timeline of kind of events in the history of women's rights, also economics was another metric I tried. There's really not a lot of correlation between Frazetta's popularity and those kinds of events. And I think what's really going on is that the popularity of this stuff comes in the wake not of like second wave feminism per se, and other racial civil rights sensibilities as well, but after that had already been incorporated into the wider culture. It's kind of a revaluation after the point-counterpoint of that kind of social movement had taken place. Now, with all that said, yeah, mostly adolescent, pre-adolescent guys were going in and looking for stuff to read that was cheap. There are stories about guys going in that big fans who would go into bookstores and tear off the covers and just stuff them in their pants and walk out with them just because they were there for the covers. Dr. Nancy.
Yeah, this is more of a comment, I guess. With regard to your referencing of Eastwood and Bond as anti-heroes, I think it might be more beneficial to you to look at John Milton and the romantic sort of anti-hero, because the shift from the more Romanized look at